Hi, and welcome to Multivirtual 2020's Right Track. I'm Vanessa Junta. I am the director of the Right Track for Multiverse Con, and this is one of our advanced craft panels. We're going to be talking about characterization, crafting a villain. Hannibal Lector, Darth Vader, he who shall not be named. Creating great villains isn't always easy. As writers, we have to be careful that our villains don't come across as mustache-twirling, melodramatic bad guys. We're about to hang out with some awesome authors who are going to talk about creating terrifying yet authentic villains. If you're watching this as part of the convention weekend stream, please come over to the Discord server and join us on the Right Track channel for a watch party, and we can all watch it together. Instructions on how to get to the Discord can be found at multiversecon.org/Discord. And speaking of multiverse, because this is our weekend, every year we choose a charity to donate to. This year, we're going to be donating to the Equal Justice Initiative. You can help us by heading over to our Ko-Fi page, which is ko-fi.com/multiversecon. And you can help by donating a couple pennies to join with our couple pennies. All donations minus fees will go to help support the Equal Justice Initiative. And you can find out more about them at eji.org. And don't forget, for more information about our panelists, please check the links below in the description, or you can head over to multiversecon.org where you can find links for all of our guests. And now I'm going to pass it over to our moderator, Darin Kennedy. Thanks.
Hello, and welcome to Crafting a Villain with Multivirtual Con on October 16th through 18th at Virtual Multiverse Con. I'm Darin Kennedy. I'll be your moderator. I would like each of my awesome panelists to introduce themselves. Kat, start with you.
Hi, I'm Kat Rambo, and I write fantasy and science fiction, and I'm really excited about this panel because I think very firmly that villains should not be two-dimensional, but it's very easy to do two-dimensional villains.
Bobby?
Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I write all kinds of stuff. I figured it was better to write about villains than become one, so it was one or the other on the career choice. So yeah.
and then somehow you managed to do both. So good job.
I know, right? Multitasking, yeah.
Multitasking at Multiverse. Who would have thought that? All right, Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Mercury. I really like villains because we have to live with them. And what better way to cope with them than murdering them off in our books?
Excellent. Marlena?
Hi, my name is Marlena Frank, and I write young adult fantasy and horror novels. I enjoy writing villains because I think that they help to craft our protagonists and our heroes and our stories. And I also like monsters, which go into the villain category.
And I'm Darin Kennedy. I write contemporary fantasy and paranormal thrillers. And so without further ado, I will ask my first question. And I think we need to start off by saying, what is a villain? What is it that makes the villain of a story the villain of the story versus some other characters? So we'll start. I want to hear Bobby's thoughts.
Well, you know, there's your villain doesn't have to be villain as like you don't have to start not all villains are Dr. Doom, I guess is a good way to put it. Your villain could be the nosy neighbor next door that causes problems. You know, so it's someone who actively is in the way of your protagonist, that is causing your protagonist grief. So that villain could be any number of things. And as writers, we get to play with the joy of, you know, deciding what our villains are going to be and who they're going to be. And, you know, it can be something as simple, like I said, as the nosy neighbor next door. If you're writing a medical thriller, the villain could be a disease. If you're writing, you know, science fiction, it could be, you know, an alien or whatever. So you've got options, and I like to play with those and, you know, get good characters out of them.
Got it. Marlena?
I see a villain as like Bobby was saying, as a character or an entity that is preventing your protagonist from doing stuff. And what I enjoy with that is that your villain can change throughout the story. You may think it's one person, then it turns out to be something entirely different as you go along. So in my opinion, a villain kind of shifts as the story goes, as the plot goes on.
Kat?
I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. Antagonist, there's someone who thwarts a character. And I'd add something else to it, which is that they can also act as a mirror for your protagonist and show what might have happened to them if they made the wrong choice or succumbed to temptation. It's not always what you do, but it's one, I think, often effective use of them.
And we mentioned Dr. Doom, who a lot of people would say is the dark mirror of Mr. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's a great example of exactly what we're talking about. And Linda?
I would like to be a little bit technical about it and say that the antagonist's goal, motivation, and conflict is directly opposed to the hero's goal, motivation, and conflict.
Got it. So I want to speak to something that Bobby said. Is he said that the disease can be the villain. Sometimes I think of a villain versus the obstacle or the antagonistic force in the book. Not necessarily the same thing. I always think of the villain has to have will or something. So I would like to hear everybody's thoughts on, can something like a disease or, you know, in the Dragon Riders of Pern, is the thread falling from the sky, is that the villain, or is that just a thing that is there? Because it clearly is causing problems, but would you call it the villain of the story? Whoever wants to jump in on that one.
I think you could argue it several ways, because you could say, yes, thread is definitely the villain, but you could also say the villain is the characters that are advocating not being prepared or that are resisting the efforts for being prepared. So it's almost like they become manifested there. But they're also, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think there's like one character who is the overarching resistance. I mean, Thread does seem like the villain there. Love to hear somebody else.
Yeah. And I imagine too, I mean, if it depends on the story you're writing. If you're writing a story about people trying to survive a hurricane, is the hurricane the villain? Or is it just other people they have to deal with? So it's, I mean, I guess technically it could be a villain, but it doesn't, there's no evil in the hurricane. The hurricane's a force of nature, but it's still the problem that we have to deal with.
Another example would be The Walking Dead. You know, I would argue the governor and Negan and the leader of the Whisperers, all of those are very clearly villains. But are the zombies villains, or are they just, something that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that might bite you?
Yeah.
Why are you making an artificial division between a villain as a person and a villain as a force of nature? I think that's an artificial divide. I don't think it's an either or. It's an and. Yes, and.
I'm just making discussion. I was just throwing it out there. We're here to talk about villains and what they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's yes and.
Yeah. And I agree with like your concept of zombies, because zombies are a force that don't necessarily have intelligence. They're just kind of like a force of nature in that regard, as the hurricane is, and they can actively be trying to thwart your hero at all turns, regardless of where they are, or even if they forget about them, it's still out there. Same with your virus and everything else. So even if they're not actively currently stopping your protagonist, they're still out there going to stop their protagonist and still a threat.
I would agree with that, yeah.
We talked earlier about when you're crafting your villain for your story, you want to make them a three-dimensional villain. You don't want them to just, be Snidely Whiplash and have lashed somebody to the railroad tracks and twirl their mustache and stare, at the camera. You want them to have like actual reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. So when you set out to build a villain for your particular story you're working on, what kind of elements do you think about to make that happen, to where you don't just have a cardboard stand-in for Tim Curry?
Well, I mean, you know, what's the old saying? Every villain thinks they're the hero of their own story. I mean, there's certainly something to that. With me, everything I do, character is where I start. And so even with the people that I know are going to be the bad guys, I try to think of them as fully realized characters. You know, even the most evil villain loves his mother. You know, there's something to them. You know, there's you can find something to like in there. And especially like I like to also spend time with my villains. I don't just they're not just there when they're facing off against the hero. I do like to, especially in my crime novels, we'll take a little time and spend with the villains, get to know them. And so trying to make them feel like that real person. Yes, they do despicable things, but then you also throw those one or two things in there they do that make you go, oh, you know, what caused this person who does this nice thing to do this, you know? And it makes them, if I feel if you've got well-rounded three-dimensional characters, then whatever you have them do, as long as it feels right to that character, the audience will be there for it.
Even Dr. Evil has Mr. Bigglesworth. So
yeah. Well, even to go back to the Doctor Doom example, Doctor Doom is trying to take over the world. He's always trying to kill the Fantastic Four. He does all these despicable things, but yet he rules a country that he rules benevolently and takes care of everyone there. And they love him there. So there is that side of him that they don't see when he's off like trying to like kill people in another country.
I would point out that if you're talking about your hero, perhaps is coming from a place of love or wanting to make the world a better place or a place of generosity, your villain is coming from a place of rage. Is a really good, it's sort of like how I like to break it down, because rage can bring us a lot of positive change, but it also can really twist into making the world very small and kind of nasty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the keys to a really effective villain that the readers can root for a little bit is that they can both sort of understand why the character's doing what they're doing, but also identify with it. Because, you know, we all kind of identify with that urge to get the last candy in the candy box, right? We're all human. We all know. And to the villains there, and we can be like, yeah, what if I gave in to my dark side?
I think that I do love villains that are fun to hate. Villains that you craft that you're just like, oh man, these are pretty terrible people. But I also like making villains that whenever you know, the story goes along and you start to learn their background and their history, you start to understand why they are the way that they are, and then your protagonist can sympathize with them, and then they slowly shift positions from villain to maybe a gray character. And I think there's some value in that too, because it goes along with the idea that villains all have their own backstory, all have their own reasons for doing things. And there's always somebody else out there that is potentially worse than what you're dealing with. So that's always another thing too.
So I'm going to ask a two-part question. The first part is going to be, in film or book or television show, what is either A, your favorite villain, or B, a villain that you think was very well done and accomplished they made a great villain, and here's why. So we'll start with Linda.
I think the Schiff in James Bond's Casino Royale is one of the best villains, because you can see absolutely his goal and his motivation and how he's going to make this goal happen, and he's constantly readjusting his plans on the fly as Bond gets in the way of all the things that he needs to do, which is to raise the money for these awful people. So he's constantly trying to change his plans, and he's on top of it, and he's very smart. And I think that makes one of a really great villain.
Gotcha. Marlena?
One of my favorite villains, I think, and it's kind of unfair because there's so much history there, but the Joker is an excellent villain. But you have threads of things where he's the sympathetic character, like in, you know, the recent Joker film. But then you have different comic books where he's just horrible and he's a terrible person. but you know, they're all the same character. They're all different facets of that same persona, that same drive, and you understand why he's doing it, but it's still terrible. So I think that's a really interesting look at that villain.
Comic book, television, movie, etc. Who is your favorite all-time Joker?
Ooh, that is hard. I really liked Dark Knight film Joker. Heath Ledger did an amazing job with that, and that would kind of blew me away. I had to go see that film so many times because that was just such a unique and fascinating performance.
I would agree. Bobby?
Well, my personal favorite Joker is Mark Hamill. That's who I hear every time I read the Joker. He has certainly like made that character his own. But one of my favorite villains in TV, I'll use TV, is the character of Boyd Crowder on Justified, who in the first episode, you know, a character who's supposed to die in the pilot. He, you know, this is how good he is. They decided to like not kill him. But like he is purely despicably evil. And then through that first season, he goes through this trying to be good. He's trying to change his ways. But the circumstances around him just will not believe he's trying and work against him, so that when he goes back to being his old self, there's still those bits in there that make you root for him because he is such a compelling character with great dialogue and played by an excellent actor. And so I think the beauty of the show too is the show really was about, you know, Raylan doing his story and Boyd doing his story. And then when they would finally run into each other, you would realize they're very much like was said earlier, they're two sides of the same coin. You know, they're very, very similar characters, and it wouldn't have taken but one little misstep for Raylan to become just like Boyd. And so playing that between the two characters, they do it very well.
I would say Ben, who was the leader of the others on Lost, was very similar. When they introduced him, I think he was supposed to be on 2 or 3 episodes and kill him off, and he ended up being a main player for the rest of the show because he was played by such a talented actor. Mm-hmm. And if anybody's watched Cobra Kai, watching those two flip on who's hero or villain for that particular week has been pretty fascinating. Kat, if I stole either of your answers, I apologize.
No, actually, one of the villains that I really love is the character of Glotka in Joe Abercrombie's trilogy, The First Law. And if you're not familiar with it, Glotka is actually a torturer and does terrible, terrible things. But you identify with him for a few reasons. One is that the reason he's such an effective torturer is that he himself was a prisoner of war for years and years. And this is why he knows torture. And he's still feeling the physical effects of them. And so like one of the things about the character is that he is always in constant pain, and it's the aftermath of what's happened to him. And the other thing is that he is absolutely convinced that what he is doing is right. And you can see where, you know, you could see where somebody believes like, yep, this is a terrible thing to do, but somebody's got to do it. And I think those make really interesting villains when it's somebody who's just like, well, yeah, I don't really want to do this, but somebody's got to step up and be the torturer. And that's just fascinating.
I think too, listening to all these answers, a lot of a lot of them have in common is that there's an undercurrent of charm to these characters that gets us, that makes us like them, even while they're doing something so despicable. There's still that little bit of charm.
And you can see that reflected in real life villains too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm thinking of like Jeffrey Dahmer and things like that. Ted Bundy was known for being really charming. People who are, you know, very charismatic, and people are like, oh, I can't imagine that person doing that. You know, you underestimate them, and that's how they get around you.
How they win. So in your fictional television, movie, book, etc. universe, what is a villain that either you think ended up a little bit two-dimensional and could have used some more crafting, or it just didn't work for you? And if you can't think of one, that's okay. We'll start with Marlena this time.
Like a villain that I wrote that came out more two-dimensional than I wanted.
Not that you noticed, not that you wrote. I'm sorry. That from Look, I'm not going to ask you to identify. How did you completely fail in your writing process? No. Like out there in fiction universe, you know, Mr. Freeze in the Batman and Robin movie played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm like, what? It just that was not right.
I feel like, and this is, you know, going off and on another media, but in a lot of video games, your villains tend to be very two-dimensional. And in fact, it's easier because they want you to never have any kind of sympathy in a video game or you know, reconsider your actions as a protagonist. It's very railroading usually. And I think that's, you know, by design for a lot of those situations, but then people come to expect villains to be like that in other media as well, in film and in books. They expect your villain to be more two-dimensional sometimes, and that's not always as much fun for the reader or the writer, I would argue.
Bobby?
I don't have one right off the top of my head. I will agree with your Schwarzenegger Mr. Freeze thing, though. He was very one-dimensional. But I think also like a lot of horror movies, like the slasher movies, there's no real character given to the killers, you know, because they're just kind of like walking talk. You know, it's like in Jaws, the shark is there and kills people. You know, the slashers basically are doing a lot of the same thing. So there's no real, we don't really get to know them outside of just, you know, watching what they do. But I don't know if it would work better if we knew more about them, you know, other than just a little bit we get at the beginning.
Have you seen it's not new, but it's now for you. There's a Geico commercial that makes fun of all the slasher films, and all the teenagers show up and they're doing stupid things, and they keep panning over to the slasher who's looking at them like, you guys are so stupid. I would argue that guy's got more like depth than a lot of the ones in the actual movies, because he's like, at least he like recognizes you people are dumb.
Yeah.
Okay, Kat.
Here I'll be controversial and say Daenerys in Game of Thrones, where I felt that the character arc was incredibly unsatisfying. And I've been sitting here kind of mentally prepping, trying to figure out why. I just was so disappointed and angry. And I think part of it was I don't feel like the character that got promised to us at the beginning of the series is the one that we ended up at the end. And that was a moment that really did not ring right for me in that conclusion.
I think there are literally tens of thousands of people who would high five you on that particular night. I happen to be one of them, watching her turn on a dime and going, I finally have everything I want. I will now burn it to the ground. That needed just a wee bit more preamble.
It just felt a little bit too much sort of like, bitches be crazy.
There's a saying about that, but we're going to leave that one alone. Linda.
I'm going to say that a villain that I think failed was Mark Strong's character in Shazam. Here's this character had no chance at ever being good. He was in this horribly abusive family. He got swept off to the wizard's place, and the wizard just basically, he had no choice. He was basically just looking at this thing, and the wizard's like, oh, no, you're not good enough. And then he gets thrown back. At no point did he have a chance of redemption. At no point did he have a chance to make a choice. Mm-hmm. And so I end up feeling really bad for the villain the entire movie and not caring a damn about Shazam. I'm like, so the wizard's a great big jerk. That's basically the moral of that story.
A lot of superhero villains I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but it does seem that a lot of times the villain is almost is less than in a superhero movie.
Yeah.
It's lazy writing.
Yeah,
right?
It's
lazy.
It's easy.
Sorry, Darin.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about it because I really enjoyed Shazam, but now that I am pontificating backward on it, I'm kind of like, you're exactly right. That is like he never had a chance.
He was forced to this position. If you want to talk about, the Star Wars prequels, and you're looking at Hayden Christensen playing the young Skywalker, it's like the Jedi were forcing him into being evil, because at no point did they actually stop and talk to him and say, hey man, what's going on? And it was like, yeah, I'd turn into a horrible baby murdering person too. Yeah.
I do love the fact that like those movies, your hero and villain are the same guy.
Yeah.
Like, we know it's coming. So seeing the little threads of how they do it, but yeah, you're right. The Jedi were dicks to him.
I know, it was
They're the real
horrible.
villains. They're the real villains.
Yeah. I was like,
If I
here's
had
this
been
really
a
cool
panelist
dude.
and not the moderator, my answer would have been Anakin Skywalker. And the other one is the poor Mr. Grinch. Because the thing I keep saying is like, if every time you appear on the screen, someone goes, "You're a mean one." I'm literally just standing here. I'm wearing a Santa hat. Do I get no cred at all? No, you're a mean one, Mr. Grinch. I wouldn't touch you with a 21.5-foot pole. And that's literally what the guy told him. I'm like,
Can't come back from that.
I will destroy everything then, and it's your fault. All right. So when you're doing a villain, it's kind of like making soup. And you can have lots of different ingredients in soup, but if you have too much salt or not enough salt or whatever, it's just not going to taste right. So you're sitting down, you're making your villain for your upcoming novel or screenplay or whatever. And what is one of your favorite ingredients to put in your villain soup?
Vanity.
Linda?
Vanity.
Go.
Vanity is a big one for mine, and I said before, rage.
Gotcha. Tell us a little more about that.
In my first 3 books, the villain is the heroine's brother, and they both are kind of vain, and they're always like checking themselves in the mirror. But he's much more vain than she is, and so that leads you to always wanting to look good, no matter sort of what you're doing. So it's like, sure, I collaborated with the Nazis, but I looked good doing it.
So he's a little narcissistic. A wee gram of narcissism.
Just a touch.
Kat, what you got?
I like obliviousness. People who are just so kind of sunk in their own worldview that they are just clueless to the world outside them. My favorite unsympathetic narrator, who actually is kind of the villain of the piece, is from Clockwork Fairies, and it's a guy he's absolutely convinced that he knows what's best, and of course that's just how things are.
My character that I always think of like that is Magneto, whose whole origin is steeped in being blown up by Hitler, and then basically becomes exactly what created him, and just never seems to quite put it together. Oh, I am exactly what I hate. So obliviousness definitely is out there. I would agree. Bobby, what you got?
Yeah, I agree with Magneto. That's good. Yeah, like the guy who was bullied becoming the bully. I'm trying to think. I like my villains to be cunning. I don't want them to. I try very hard not to make my villains stupid. Because sometimes in movies and books we see where the reason the hero wins is because the villain is stupid. But I also like my villains to have a little bit of ego, especially if they're smart. They know they're smart. They know they're cunning. They know what they're doing. And sometimes ego is what leads to their downfall. But I do like cunning and smarts, and I want them to go in with a plan most of the time. I mean, there are times where you want a character who becomes a villain because of events, but for the most part, yeah, if they've gone into it, they know what they're doing. They're not just they're not just swept along. They have a plan.
Kind of like Scott Evil always telling Dr. Evil, just kill Austin Powers right now. Don't leave him in the easily escapable track with the sharks with laser beams on their foreheads. So
it's like, take a gun and
He's right there. I'll kill him. We can do it together like son and father. Marlena, what you got?
I like to have villains who failed a lot in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Like they've tried to be clever about things and people have found them out. And, they just had a string of failures or have been wronged in the past a lot. I think that really feeds into that rage, like Linda was talking about, kind of setting them up to have this feeling of wanting to have revenge and wanting to get back at people who have wronged them or who have, led them to fail in the past. I really like that about villains.
Gotcha. So what do y'all think? Somebody touched on this before. I don't remember who, about the redeemable versus the irredeemable villain. You know, when you're reading a story and you're writing a story, do you like to have your I'm blanking on Cersei's brother's name from Game of Thrones.
Rhaegar?
No. Cersei's
Cersei's brother. Oh, Jamie
Lannister. You know, do you want to have your Jamie Lannister, who can start out despicable but kind of be good, and then, to Kat's point, turn immediately evil at the very end, out of nowhere, or do you want them to just be straight? I mean, not two-dimensionally so, but just straight ahead at the end, just as nasty as they were at the beginning? Or is it either or?
Yeah.
Kind of depends on your story.
Yeah.
I like both. I like forcing the person who is kind of more in the gray area to have to work with the really evil people, and they don't always, get along. I think that's more entertaining and more interesting to see them having to butt heads constantly.
I do think too, it needs to, you kind of want it to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
TV shows especially are bad about taking a popular villain and to keep them around, almost neuter what you liked about the character to keep them around. The first one that comes to mind is like Spike from Buffy, who was a great villain. And then to keep him around, he gets sillier and sillier as he goes.
They literally neutered him by putting a little chip into his brain, wouldn't let him bite people. I mean, they literally neutered him, yes.
Yeah. And so, but I think, you can get some great mileage from seeing a villain try to become better, to try to be redeemed. Batman the Animated Series did a wonderful job. I think at one point, every villain of his rogues gallery tried to go straight. Mm-hmm. And you would see why it didn't work, or and certainly the MCU has done it pretty well. They've managed to make Loki into Loki kind of becomes a hero, and other characters like that. So I mean, it is doable. I think it shouldn't be a quick just snap your finger change though. There needs to be a reason for it.
We need to see it. That was why I was sad about Daenerys, because you didn't see her make that choice. It just happened. You didn't see her get enraged or sad or upset. She just burned down King's Landing and
snapped.
Yeah, it's like, I would like a little bit more I wanted to see her act it,
The one like that Bobby just reminded me of was Sylar from Heroes, who basically for the entire first season, what he's doing is he's running around with anybody with superpowers, literally cutting their head open and taking their brains out and stealing their powers. And then in the second season, every other episode, he's a good guy. And I kept raising my hand as I'm watching this, like, y'all remember he's the guy that sliced people's heads open, took their brains out and stole their powers, right? There's things you can come back from, and there's things you kind of don't.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if it's never mentioned again.
Right.
Yeah.
That's first season Sylar. He doesn't do that anymore. He's fine. I'm like, sure.
Yeah, that's one of the things where I think it's because they like the actor. So they do everything they can to keep the actor, and sometimes to the detriment of the story.
I once tried to write a Scheherazade story in which the Sultan was redeemed, but you get right down to it, there is no redeeming basically a mass murderer.
Yeah.
No matter how hard I tried, there was there's no way I can make this guy a hero.
But in the end of the original one, they get married and live happily ever after, and you're always kind of like, he killed all those
women. Yeah.
And I think right now this is something that we want to be thinking about, because the world is changing and we're seeing a lot of dynamics and power shifting. And just to be a little I mean, I just like, we used to be big fans of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is a police comedy, if you're not familiar with it. And nowadays, I'm kind of like, I don't know that I'm as comfortable with that, some nuances of that narrative, to the point where I don't watch it anymore. And so one of the things that I think is useful to people with villains is for them to see people being redeemed and to understand that there is redemption. And I mean, and I'm not saying, you know, like every villain has to be redeemable, but I think that's a very powerful and necessary narrative right now that, I don't know, I'm just sort of saying some contentious things for the end of the panel, just to watch to see what Darin does in reality.
Well, I was actually going to say a lot of people may see facets of themselves not only in the heroes, but in the villains. And if they can see someone who is the villain of the story, who does something that they do get redeemed, that may give them hope, to sort of speak to Kat's point. And so maybe redemption of villains has a positive thing, because at the end, we want our readers to be built up by what they're reading from us, whatever we've written.
And I think it really depends on what they've done to make them a villain. Like Linda was saying, a mass murderer, that's a lot harder. But if someone has, you know, accidentally killed someone as your villain, or, you know, they've done minimal amount of villainy level things, that is more doable. That is something that, you know, if you've got readers who would probably be identifying with that person because of their, you know, painful backstory, or, you know, things that they've been through that have been outside of their control, you kind of want to have some redemption arc availability there, because you don't want those people to feel like they can't come back from that. You know, you want to give them hope.
But I don't think anybody wants to read the Joker is the new Robin story. I don't think anybody wants to read that, you know. Joker is kind of, and I would argue Siler, oh, he of the skullcapness needs to remain villainous, but they did not do that. When you're writing your villains, and there's always like a power dynamic, you know, I would argue like one of my favorite hero villains is Professor X and Magneto. And I would say that they are on a very similar power level, Chuck in the brain and Maggie sort of the world. But there are villains where the hero, like Superman and Lex Luthor, is kind of like this, whereas Mr. Fantastic and Galactus is kind of like this. So let's talk about power differential between your hero and your villain, and how you've used that in your stories. I know that was a very roundabout question, but we're coming to the end of the hour, and I'm pulling it out. So go, Bobby. This one's yours.
Okay. Well, certainly, I mean, giving your heroes something to overcome, a challenge to overcome, is always an excellent storytelling technique to see Reed Richards get something over on Galactus, you know, which is basically, you know, Galactus is this huge, you know, demigod that eats planets. So seeing like this guy being able to outsmart him is a wonderful thing, you know. Others, I mean, so yeah, sometimes having that, and not everything is like Batman dealing with the Joker is not really a big insurmountable thing physically, but the Joker is just so insane. There's no telling what he's liable to do. Same with Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor is a very smart man, and who is also convinced that he's trying to save the Earth from the menace of this alien, who he feels is the beginning of more aliens to come. And he's not wrong, because after Superman shows up, more aliens come, and people come after him, and the cities are getting destroyed. So at one point, Lex is not wrong, but what Lex is doing is wrong to try to stop it. So, I mean, so you can play with different things. I mean, if you look at the Avengers movies, if you look at Thanos' thinking, he's not wrong. There's too many people, there's too many problems, there's not enough food for everybody. You know, if half the people were gone, life would be simpler and better for everybody. He's not wrong. But then again, he goes and wipes out half the people in the universe. That's not so good. So it's like they have these big things, and so being able to just get over on those challenges is fun to write. You know,
Linda.
Oh boy, I was so caught up in Bobby's awesome commentary that I'm like,
We go.
wow.
I'm here all week, people. No.
So, and we're talking about power levels. I think it's kind of like how you show your character's growth. Let's say you've got, you're following a child hero like Harry Potter, right? And you show him kind of overcoming littler evils as it goes along, as he shows his own strength and the power of gathering his group together and how they fight against that. So it's like, I think it shows a really great arc when you have different powering levels with your heroes and your villains. I think the most effective villain in Harry Potter is Dolores.
Oh yeah.
Because everybody knows that kind of wickedness. Not everyone has experienced the kind of evil that Voldemort is. But we've all experienced someone like Dolores. And so that's a very real world. It's very immediate, and that's a kind of a power differential that's institutional. It's very eye-opening. So you got to have lots of different kinds of things that get in the way.
I'd say she's definitely one of the ones that needs to be left irredeemable, because everybody kind of likes Voldemort and everybody kind of likes the Malfoys and everybody kind of likes Bellatrix, but man, Dolores can just be taken away by the centaurs and never seen again. Yeah. And that's just fine.
Yeah.
Marlena, what you got?
Well, I do really love having your hero that has very little power and your very powerful villain. I like to see the hero have to, either use their wits to get around them or, build up their powers to be able to really take them on. I think that's a really compelling storyline. I like it when they're also even power levels too, because like you said, with Professor Xavier and Magneto, like they're very equal and they're on the same field and they're both recruiting and they're both, using their intelligence to try to match wits with the other player. I think that's really great. It's not as compelling for me when there's a really powerful hero and a very not very powerful villain, because I feel like it's just not as much of a challenge. And Luthor, while he isn't physically able to match Superman, he's able to mentally, thwart him a lot. And he has to pull everything out to try to do it. But he does put up a good fight against him. And I think that's really fascinating to me that he's still able to do that, regardless of having an unequal power level.
And I think in Luthor's mind, he is your lower level hero that's up against this vastly more powerful villain in his own mind. I think it's really, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, and if he was more likable, you would probably be following him as the main storyline, you know what I mean? But he's not. So he's not as identifiable with people, I think. So you can't really latch on to him as a hero as easily. He's a pretty terrible person, especially as you see his life fleshed out in comics, I think.
I've always thought it was really interesting that ostensibly the most powerful superhero ever has an unpowered main villain. And no matter how many Mongol or guy that killed Superman, come on, Bobby, help me.
Oh, Doomsday?
Doomsday. No matter how many of those you create, the only villain of Superman that anybody cares about is Lex Luthor, because he's such a great villain. And I've always thought that is one of the most interesting creations like that I've ever seen. Kat, I'm waiting with bated breath to hear your answer.
Well, and I think Lex Luthor he's more like a Batman level villain, right? He's sort of like Batman turned inside out. I think so. One of the things that you want to do when you're writing is keep making things harder and harder for your character and increasing the level and raising the stakes and all of that. And your villain's power level is part of that. You obviously don't want a villain who's going to start not particularly super powerful, then sort of get less powerful as time goes along. You always want that sort of increasing motion. But it's another one of those mechanisms that we have for controlling things. And I think that's what's fun, right? It's fun to create a villain you're kind of rooting for and but I'm maybe rooting for the hero and oh shit, how are they gonna resolve it in a way that's satisfying for both of them, right?
And then you're like, this can't end well for anyone involved. Oh no.
this is going to end badly. And we're down to about the last 6 or 5 minutes. And so in your stories that you have written, who is your favorite villain and why? I'll start with Kat this time.
Oh, Jesus, I thought you were going to do that.
Hold on, let me look at my bookshelf.
My favorite villain is actually from the space opera that's coming out next year. And he is the king of the space pirates. And actually, despite all the stuff that I said about redeemable villains, he is absolutely unredeemable and evil and over the top.
Yay. What is the name of the space opera that everyone should buy next year?
It's called You Sexy Thing, which is the name of the spaceship that they steal that isn't particularly happy about being stolen.
That is brilliant.
Love it. Love it. Marlena, what's your favorite villain from your stuff?
The stuff that I've got coming out, I've got the Gray People in The Seeking, which comes out this month. There are supposed to be the protectors of the town, and they're like creepy, staying out in the woods, watching over people, making sure they're okay, but they're not really protectors of the town. So they're kind of, everyone thinks that they're helpful, but they're not. They end up being very nasty creatures, actually.
Gotcha. Linda?
My favorite villains are in my book, Curse of the Spider Woman. And it takes place in modern Greece during their financial crisis. And so the main villains are based on, I think it was, I don't remember the real world name, but I called them the heirs of Socrates, for people who were taking advantage of the financial crisis and trying to disrupt the world even better. So it's kind of this James Bond Greek mythology thing going on.
Bobby.
My favorite villain that I created is from a short story I did years ago. It's this ship full of scientists and with just a few military people. They're on their way back home. I've been in space a long time. They're tired. They're irritable. They're like, we're just ready to go home. And nothing's going to stop us until they find hear a distress signal, and they find this space-suited person floating in space and rescue them. And inside is a woman who looks a lot like, she looks very human, and she's begging them to return her home. And then we find out all this stuff about her as we go along that makes her the villain of the piece. And she's, we find out, she's really a shapeshifter, and the suit scans people that finds them. I'm gonna just go spoil this for anybody that hasn't read. Sorry. The suit scans the people and says, "Oh, these people are human." Well, she's a gelatinous, like shapeshifter type creature, and so the suit will help her morph into look like them, so that when they crack the suit open, it's somebody that looks like them. So they're more willing to help them. And so when they take her home, that's when her people kill those people and eat them, because she is the bait. She is the bait they stick out there. And so she's such a cool character that just the way she plays everybody and does everything. Yeah, she's been my favorite to write.
Excellent. I would say mine is the antagonist and villain from my Fugue and Fable series. Is that the same person or not? You'll have to read it to find out. Thank you very much to my awesome panelists. I have had a blast this hour. I would like each one of you to say, can people find your stuff on the Multiverse store during Multiverse? And then just tell us what your website is so people can find you online if they would like to. Bobby.
I hope my stuff's in the store. I have to check on that. I hope so. BobbyNash.com. You can find everything there. I'm all over social media. Yeah, come by and say hi.
Marlena?
I'm not sure if my stuff's in the store or not. I'll have to find that out. My website is marlenafrank.com, and I've got this book coming out in October 27th this year.
So you should all be seeking her book as soon as possible. Wink. Linda?
I think my books are in the bookstore. I'll find out. And I'm at www.lindamercury.com. And you can buy all my books there, and you can buy them at all the other e-retailers. And I hope y'all have a great day.
Kat?
I, like everybody else, I'm not sure if the books are there or not. I hope that they are. One book that I do want to do a shout out to is I just have this book that came out with James Morrow and Harry Turtledove called And the Last Trump Shall Sound, which I appreciate the cover, but it's a very timely book, should you wish. But it has perhaps, the part that James Morrow wrote is hysterically funny and well worth checking out. Mine is not funny at all.
And your website is?
Oh, catrambo.com. Yes.
And I'm at darinkennedy.com, and you can find my stuff on Amazon or on my website. My stuff will be in the bookstore, and we're filming this a couple weeks ahead of time. So by then we'll have all that ironed out. Thank you very much to my panelists. I had a blast. This was awesome. I would love to do all this again sometime. Maybe we can talk about heroes.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This was delightful.
Yes, this was fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Crafting a Villain on the Right Track. We hope you found this panel fun, interesting, and helpful. Remember, for more about our awesome author panelists, please check down below in the description or head over to multiversecon.org to find links on how to find them and all good kind of stuff. We've got lots of great programming this weekend, so be sure to come out to our Discord server and hang out. That's at multiversecon/Discord. And finally, would you like some Multiverse swag? We've got some cool stuff. So while you're at the website, check out the store. We've got shirts, masks, posters. We even have enamel pins and this really cool map that I'm totally going to put up on my wall in my office. Anyway, thanks a lot. We hope you've had a good time, and we'll see you next time.